Three orphan girls in worn clothes wait desperately outside the old children's home about to be demolished. When James Whitmore, tech billionaire, steps out of his black Rolls-Royce, the eldest of the three, Emily, 11 years old, finds the courage to approach. With a trembling voice, she whispers a question that will change 6 lives forever. What happens in the next few minutes transforms a ruthless businessman into the most loving father in England. A story that will make you believe in miracles of family love. The evening sun painted the ancient stones of Kensington golden when James Whitmore stepped out of his black Rolls-Royce. At 48, with a fortune of $2 billion built in the tech industry, he was accustomed to controlling every situation in his perfectly organized life. That October afternoon, he had an appointment with the mayor to purchase land, where he would build a new headquarters for his artificial intelligence company. The plot was located right next to the old municipal children's home, a Victorian building that was to be demolished to make way for progress. But as he headed towards the town hall, 3 small figures caught his attention. They were girls dressed in gray and brown uniforms, standing by the gate of the children's home with shabby cardboard suitcases at their feet. Emily, 11 years old, had chestnut hair braided imperfectly, and brown eyes that shone with surprising determination for her age. Charlotte, 9 years old, clutched a threadbare teddy bear, whilst Grace, 7 years old, hid behind her older sisters. The old children's home showed clear signs of neglect. Boarded windows, peeling walls, the sign "Children's Home" hanging crooked above the entrance. It was the last day before permanent closure, and these 3 were the final residents without a determined destination. James noticed their desperate gaze, but initially thought to continue. In his life, there was no room for problems unrelated to business. He had built his tech empire with iron discipline, sacrificing personal relationships for professional success. But as he passed by them, Emily did something unexpected. With courage that shouldn't belong to an 11-year-old girl, she broke away from the group and approached him. Her eyes were moist with held-back tears, but her voice was steady when she whispered the question that would change everything. James stopped, surprised by the boldness of this slight girl. He looked down at her, noticing how she pressed her little hands together to stop them trembling. His business instinct suggested he continue, but something in those eyes paralyzed him. Emily took a deep breath and explained their situation with devastating maturity. The children's home was closing that day. They didn't know where they would be sent, and she had heard he was an important man who might be able to help them. The words were simple, but loaded with such pure desperation that James felt something stir in his chest, an emotion buried for years beneath responsibility and ambition. He looked more carefully at the 3 sisters, Charlotte biting her lip to stop from crying, Grace watching him with enormous, hopeful eyes, and Emily waiting with a dignity that many adults didn't possess. When he asked for their names, Emily responded by introducing all 3, adding that they were sisters and didn't want to be separated. At that moment, James Whitmore made the most important decision of his life. Mayor Robert Thompson emerged from the town hall expecting to find James ready for the most important meeting of the year for the city. Instead, he found him kneeling before 3 orphan girls, listening attentively to their stories. Emily had begun recounting with heartbreaking maturity. She and her sisters had been at the children's home for 3 years, after their parents died in a car accident. The Kensington Children's Home was the last in the borough, but budget cuts had made it impossible to keep it open. The girl explained that the next day they would be separated. Charlotte would go to a family in Manchester, Grace to one in Birmingham, and she would probably go to another children's home in Liverpool, but they wanted to stay together. Charlotte approached timidly, telling how Emily always looked after them, reading bedtime stories and helping with homework. Without her, she confessed, she and Grace were frightened. Grace found courage and added that they were good girls, knew how to cook and clean, never had tantrums. If someone would love them, she promised, they would love them forever. James felt his heart tighten. He looked at these three girls who had faced devastating losses but maintained a strength he had lost in the race for success. The mayor approached, explaining that procedures were already underway, and social services would come to collect them the next morning. It was then that James spoke the words that surprised everyone, including himself. He said he wanted to adopt them. All three. Together. The mayor's eyes widened. The three girls looked at him with disbelief. James himself was surprised by the spontaneity of his declaration. When Emily asked if he really wanted them, James answered with a yes that tasted of absolute truth. For the first time in 20 years, he was making a decision based purely on his heart. While the mayor began explaining legal procedures and bureaucratic steps, James watched three girls embracing and crying with happiness. For the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to feel truly wealthy. That evening, instead of discussing business and profits, James Whitmore found himself dining with three girls in a small restaurant in the neighborhood, listening to their dreams and hopes for the future. It was the beginning of a transformation that would change the very meaning of success for a man who had always believed money was everything. The following 3 months were a whirlwind of emotions and changes that James could never have imagined. The adoption procedures moved quickly thanks to his solicitors and the fact that the girls had no other living relatives. During this period, Emily, Charlotte, and Grace lived in the suite of London's most luxurious hotel. But James immediately understood they needed a real home, stability, roots. He thus made the second most important decision of his life. He bought a restored Georgian mansion in the Cotswolds, with an enormous garden, swimming pool, and breathtaking views of the countryside. But above all, with space to grow a family. He had 3 bedrooms completely renovated for his future daughters. Emily's was painted blue with a huge library, having discovered she loved reading. Charlotte had a room in pastel colors, filled with soft toys, whilst Grace got a small art studio for her drawing talent. But the most profound changes occurred in James himself. The man who had never had time for anything but work completely revolutionized his routine. Every morning, instead of diving into business, he had breakfast with the girls, listening to accounts of their nighttime dreams and daily plans. He had hired a wonderful housekeeper, Mrs. Margaret, but every evening he was punctually home for dinner. Emily proved to be a girl of extraordinary intelligence, with a passion for reading that led her to devour books. James began taking her to the finest bookshops in London, amazed at how she could discuss literature with unexpected depth. Charlotte developed a deep love for cooking, spending hours with Mrs. Margaret learning traditional English recipes. James found himself returning home, hoping to taste her increasingly refined culinary experiments. Grace was a born artist. Her colorful drawings decorated the walls of the mansion, and James commissioned a mural in her room, painted by a local artist according to her designs.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
The real magic happened during family dinners. The large antique oak table in the dining room, which for years had only hosted work meetings, now resonated with the girls' laughter, their daily stories, their questions about the world. One evening, Emily called him Daddy for the first time, and James felt his heart melt completely. When the girl asked if he had been happy before meeting them, he answered honestly that he thought he had been. But now he understood that wasn't happiness. It was just emptiness filled with things. Charlotte observed with childlike wisdom that perhaps God had made them meet because he needed a family, and they needed a daddy. That night, James stayed awake reflecting on how 3 girls had transformed his life more than 20 years of professional success had ever done. 6 months after the official adoption, James Whitmore had become a completely different man. Not just in appearance, he smiled more frequently, his eyes had recovered a lost light, but especially in how he viewed life and work. His tech company continued to be industry leader, but now James had introduced revolutionary changes. He had launched free training programs for disadvantaged youth, scholarships for underprivileged children, and had transformed one of his offices into a temporary shelter for families in need. He had also created the Emily, Charlotte, and Grace Foundation, which supported children's homes throughout England, providing scholarships, free medical care, and psychological support for children in difficulty. But the most beautiful transformation occurred daily in the Cotswolds mansion. Emily, now 12 years old, had become an exceptional student. She attended the most prestigious private school in Oxford, with a year's advancement, and already spoke of studying medicine to follow in her adoptive father's footsteps. But not business medicine, the kind that helps those who cannot afford it. Charlotte had developed extraordinary culinary talent. At just 10 years old, she cooked dishes worthy of a professional chef. James had installed a professional kitchen in the mansion, and on Sundays, the family organized lunches for friends with Charlotte as head chef. Grace had blossomed as a little artist. Her drawings were displayed throughout the mansion, and James had organized an exhibition of her works at the local museum. The girl dreamed of becoming a children's book illustrator. More than individual talents, what filled James with pride was seeing how his daughters had grown confident, loving, and generous. They had maintained the compassion that came from their difficult past, but now also had the confidence that comes from being deeply loved. One summer evening, whilst all 4 observed the stars in the garden, Grace asked what he would have done if he hadn't met them. James answered that he would probably be in his office working late, thinking about the next deal. He would have had more money, but would have been a much poorer man. Emily added that they too would have been poorer, not of money, but of love. When she asked what he had given them in return, James answered sincerely that they had given him purpose, teaching him that success isn't measured in pounds, but in smiles, that true wealth isn't what you own, but how much you love, and are loved. Charlotte snuggled into his arms, observing that then they were all rich, and James confirmed, very rich indeed. That night, for the first time in 20 years, James Whitmore fell asleep smiling, knowing that at dawn he would wake for something worth more than any business deal: breakfast with his daughters. 2 years after the miraculous encounter, the Whitmore family had become a legend of hope throughout England. James, now 50 years old, had transformed not only his personal life, but also his way of doing business. Whitmore Technologies had become the first British tech company to offer free digital training for socially disadvantaged youth. The foundation had opened 5 new modern children's homes with revolutionary living standards. But the real revolution was taking place in the Cotswolds mansion, which had become the center of an extraordinary solidarity network. Emily, now 13 years old, had founded a reading club for disadvantaged children. Every Saturday, the mansion filled with children from difficult families who came to listen to stories, do homework, and feel part of something special. The girl who 2 years earlier had no home now offered a symbolic one to anyone who needed it. Charlotte had transformed her culinary passion into a social mission. She had convinced James to open a free cooking school for young people in difficulty, where she herself, despite being 11, assisted professional chefs. Her often older students listened to her with respect and affection. Grace had begun creating illustrated books with stories of adopted children and special families. Her Her drawings were so moving that a London publishing house had published her first book, donating all proceeds to the foundation. James watched his daughters grow, realizing they had kept the promise from the first day. They were truly good girls who knew how to love forever. The biggest surprise came when the mayor of London appeared with a delegation to announce that the city had decided to dedicate the new square that would arise where the old children's home stood to them. It was Emily who answered for the family, suggesting it be called Hope Square, where every child can find a home, instead of bearing their name. That evening, during the family dinner, James told his daughters that when he had met them, he thought he was saving them. But actually, it was they who had saved him. Charlotte smiled, replying that perhaps they had all saved each other. While the stars shone over the English countryside, 4 people miraculously united by destiny knew their story was only the beginning of something much greater. 5 years had passed since that October afternoon when 3 brave girls had forever changed James Whitmore's life. In 2029, the Whitmore family had become a symbol of hope throughout Britain. Emily, 17 years old, had been admitted to medicine at Cambridge University with a full scholarship. She dreamed of becoming a pediatrician and opening a free clinic for children in difficulty. Charlotte, 15 years old, had opened her first teaching restaurant where she taught cooking to disadvantaged youth. Grace, 13 years old, had published 3 illustrated books exhibited in European galleries. James, now 53 years old, had sold the tech company to dedicate himself entirely to the foundation, which had helped over 10,000 children across Britain. That November morning, during the family breakfast, he received a phone call that transported him to the past. Social services in Edinburgh had 3 orphaned brothers, aged 7, 9, and 11, in a difficult situation, and were asking for his help. James looked at Emily, Charlotte, and Grace, who had heard the conversation. Their eyes shone with the same light as 5 years earlier when they had decided to become a family. Emily immediately decided to go and meet them. 3 hours later, they were on their way to Edinburgh. At the care center, they found 3 boys sitting on a bench: Oliver, 11 years old, Henry, 9 years old, and William, 7 years old, with the same expressions of hope and fear that James remembered so well. But this time, it wasn't James who approached first. It was Emily who knelt before Oliver, telling him that they too had been orphans before finding the best daddy in the world. That evening, in the Cotswolds mansion, the large antique oak table hosted 7 people for the first time. James watched his 3 daughters helping the newcomers feel at home, sharing stories and dreams. When Grace asked if there was enough love in the family for 3 more children, James answered that he had learned how love never runs out when it's shared. On the contrary, it multiplies. 6 months later, Oliver, Henry, and William Whitmore were officially part of the family. The mansion had been extended, the tables lengthened, the laughter multiplied. But above all, love had found a way to expand infinitely. One evening, whilst all 7 dined together, James raised his eyes to the stars shining through the large window. He thought of that afternoon 5 years ago, when a brave girl had asked a question that changed everything. Now he understood it hadn't been a simple request, but destiny's invitation to discover life's true meaning. The circle of love had closed to open again, bigger, stronger, infinite, like the English sky that watched over Britain's most special family. Did this story move you? Did it make you reflect on what it really means to be wealthy? If you too believe that every child deserves a family, that love can change the world, and that sometimes it's enough to stop and listen to perform miracles, give it a like and share this video. Tell us in the comments, have you ever met a child who changed your perspective on life? What do you think when you see children in difficulty? Do you believe we all deserve a second chance to love and be loved? Subscribe to the channel for more stories that celebrate the power of family love, the importance of adoption, and the magic that happens when we open our hearts to those who need it. Like, comment, share. Because every story of family and hope reminds us that true wealth isn't found in bank accounts, but in our children's smiles, and that sometimes a simple question can change everything. Could you speak with us for a moment?